We'll make this. We'll continue with our questions. Now, I should have asked you this at the very start. Make sure that I'm pronouncing your name correctly, Mr. Chuka.
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 Oh, that's right. Good. That's good.
Hopefully that's not a tohu. I took that photo, so.
He mihi kawana kia koe te rangatira, ko tai mai tēnei rā. We've been informed that you had some appointments this morning, but good to see you join us. We've just got to Mr. Chuka's evidence, and so we're just asking him some questions, and then we'll carry on with the rest of the hearing. Ka pai. Mr. Chuka, just some questions. I've got about 4 or 5. The first one is, this is on the cover of your statement of evidence, and you've got a Bachelor of Science, double major Environmental Studies and Geography. Which university was that?
Victoria.
Victoria, thank you. In terms of environmental management, what would you say are your particular areas of experience and expertise? What are the, if you were going to pick 3 things, what are the things that you'd say you have the strongest knowledge in?
My knowledge and experience largely from being in this position and being involved with numerous plan changes and these formal procedures, and humbly attempting to insert tangata whenua aspirations within these formal decision-making processes. I mean, that's one area, but that's the large area that underpins everything.
Thank you. Just turning to, this is at paragraph 33 onwards, and it's at page 16 of your evidence in chief, and it's under the heading Treaty of Waitangi and Ngāti Kahungunu Rights. And yourself and a number of other submitters have mentioned Waitangi Tribunal recommendations and findings, Waitangi Tribunal claims that are yet to be heard, and also the principles of the Tiriti o Waitangi, the Treaty of Waitangi. And for our purposes under the Act, and you know this very well in terms of our overarching responsibilities to take into account the principles of the Treaty of Waitangi, and the Tribunal articulation of those principles is helpful to us because they're the lead organisation in terms of that area of work. But I wondered whether you had a view, and perhaps Mr. Enright might have a view as well, in regards to those matters which have been a recommendation and finding of the tribunal that might be relevant in terms of fresh water allocation, water quality, and the such like, that are not only specific to this area but other areas in New Zealand, and how we may or may not take those into account in regards to our deliberations.
I'll pass that to Mr. Enright, and if I have anything to add, I'll...
Thank you.
So I think there's a fairly substantial case law that you can have regard to Waitangi Tribunal reports.
Yes.
They're not binding, but they are obviously relevant and often highly persuasive depending on subject matter. Obviously the reports on the freshwater claims are particularly on point, and I think Niall in his evidence has cross-referenced those, so we certainly rely on that. And it's obviously a moving space. The tribunal has been quite critical of the failure by the RMA to address treaty rights and principles, and not give effect really to Section 8 RMA and also the Section 6E parameters. So certainly those are good reasons to give appropriate weight and priority to those issues.
So just to paraphrase what you've said to us, is that those findings and recommendations are not binding on us, but we should have regard to them where they are relevant.
Yeah, and give them weight.
Yep. Thank you. My next question is just in a similar vein as the statutory acknowledgements, and I have some experience in this area, partly to do with the frustration of the statutory acknowledgements, not in what they say, but in what they can do. And I'm thinking of some experiences in the Mackenzie Basin where you had very articulate description of the values, the issues that were in very specific water bodies. However, they weren't necessarily, they were identified in the planning documents but not given much weight in terms of then how does that turn into a policy framework of objectives, policies and methods. And so I just wondered if you had a view, and I'm just aware that in those statutory acknowledgements that are in the deed of settlement and in the legislation, it's often clause number 3, and no one understands what it means, and unfortunately I do. It's where the acknowledgement doesn't have any more power than there would be if otherwise there wasn't one. It's words to that effect. It's a strange legalese that when you're signing the deed of settlement, you don't know what it means, but it's clause number 3. It can't be that important, but it actually is. And I just wondered whether you had a view. This perhaps is for you, Mr. Enright, because there's clearly well articulated statutory acknowledgements for many areas. However, for our purposes, what do you think might be the appropriate way of being acknowledged? Where do they fit in the RMA?
I share your sentiments. It's the same issue. What does acknowledgement mean? And so I've focused on the word, the regard, and the examples I've given here. If in the statutory acknowledgement it refers to specific waterways, species and practices, and that provides itself an opportunity to have regard for those waterways, those species and those practices. In the first instance, basically, are they present still, those species? So that kind of the monitoring, and do we understand if we don't have any, information on the species practices and those waterways and how they relate, then I struggle to see the actual regard. A more legal view from our council, probably.
I couldn't put it better. May take into account. What's important though is that it really is about, we don't have to start from ground zero. We don't have to prove all of these matters again. You can take them as read, that there are these really important relationships with the waters, the catchments, and they're actually quite, comparatively to some other iwi statements of association, they're actually quite powerful, very much water focused. And so, and they tell the creation stories and some of the whakapapas. So it actually does merit weight. It's directly on point to this plan change. That would be our position.
Maybe to ask the same question a slightly different way, do you see a role of the statutory acknowledgements within a Natural Policy Statement 2020 framework, particularly Te Mana Te Wai?
So again, because the MPS 20 is replete with a requirement to consider tangata whenua values and have regard and basically recognise, provide for. So yes, that is very much consistent with the higher order NPSF in 2020.
Thank you. I did have a question regards that it's Exhibit 8A, and this might be perhaps a question for the council, just so I know what this document is. So this is it looks to me like an editorial review of the tank plan change first draft in 31st of May 2018. And I just wanted to check that that's what did this document end up being? So I'm assuming that this is the peer review that's been talked about. When I've read it, and it read more to me like an editorial review rather than a peer review. Okay, okay. So it's not the final. And when was the final prepared?
In July, the end of July 2018.
Okay, so quite shortly afterwards.
Exhibit 8C.
Okay, okay, that's great.
Mr. Chair, can I just follow up a question on
Yeah,
this?
sure. That was the end of my questions. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah. So, at your paragraph 29, you discussed the peer review comments from Mr. Constantine and list the number of those, his findings, I suppose, which is, I think, have come from that Exhibit 8B. But I'm looking at your Exhibit 8C, which his my understanding, his final peer review, although it is marked with a draft on your copy, but his conclusions say, that I'm paraphrasing, it is my opinion the plan is fit for purpose, consistent with the parent plan, and further meets the requirements of the Resource Management Act. That, to me, is quite different language to what he had in his, or what you've listed in your evidence as his preliminary comments, and interested to hear what your thoughts are there.
I believe he was referring to its consistency with the flavour of the RRMP and that approach, which was education, work with those matters I talked about before. I know that can occur still with the comments he made initially. I mean, you could still have a non-regulatory approach and be in alignment with the RRMP, which I think, I guess it is the council's decision to do so, and we're highlighting the concerns he raised, that we have the same concerns, and it may align with the RRMP, but those initial concerns don't align with us just as much as the RRMP approach doesn't align with us, and I think we can look for changes that won't necessarily be inconsistent with the RRMP. They could still be consistent with that, and also consistent with the national policy statement, because bearing into mind the RRMP was 2006 and prior to all the NPS documents. So that's why there's a bit of imbalance there.
So it is marked draft for review, and my other question, either to you or to the council, is this the final, or is there a final?
This is the final.
Okay.
Yeah, apologies, we never had the watermark taken off by Mr. Constantine, but it is the final review.
Right, thank you.
Do we have any other questions?
Kia ora ngā. I just have a couple of questions. I just raised this one because I think you're the only submitter that I've noticed has raised this. So you talked about the how the term Kaitiaki inside that gets watered down or misses the point sometimes when it doesn't take an expanded meaning. In your experience, is that true of a lot of the Māori terms that go across into these official documents, that somehow we lose the meaning of what we have in the ordinary understanding of these words, like Māori and wahitapu and etc.?
Yes, in short answer, it is risky with our cultural terms being put into formal legislation, and we've talked about kaitiakitanga being appropriately defined by those who have mana whenua to an area. So when they go into these formal documents and there's a set definition, at times others might say, but no, this is your kaitiakitanga, and we might not capture the nuances in terms of the relationship and how it's been affected. So that's the long answer, medium answer.
Is this something you think we need to discuss amongst ourselves about how these terms are used or maybe used against our wishes?
Yes, in the RMP, and it's was brought up in our engagement through Tank and subsequent submissions, and Maury Black talked about it, that we need amendments to the glossary in the RMP. There's the definition of mahingokai, which talks about food cultivation. In our submission, I talk about and reference that there's basically 3 ways you could say mahingokai. It's the species. Then mahingokai might be the place where we get the kai, and then so nouns, and then the practice of the mahingokai, and doing it, and all of them are equally important, and it can be problematic when you're defining them, and the definition in our policy context says food cultivation areas, which is quite limiting. I know, at least in the Greater Wellington, they recognise 2 of those definitions, was referenced, and in subsequent documents it's been spoken about interchangeably, those 3 parts, the 2 nouns, the species, the place, and then the practice. Ideally we'll have them all recognised as they've all intertwined. We can go to a place, but if there's no water, then there's not much mahi going on, and if you can go to water if the species ain't there. And that's the regard part in the statutory acknowledgements. Like, do we actually know? I mean, it doesn't mean that you have to protect them, the regard or acknowledge, but we should at least know whether they're present or maybe an indicator of their status. Yeah.
Thank you. You're a proponent of hard limits.
Yes.
Have you had any reaction to that position from council or from others, that like imposing hard limits on the various levels of pollution in it?
Yes. Basically, no. There's a reluctance to do hard limits. For our mind, this will give us certainty and confidence, which we need. We're talking about the same thing repeatedly, and just as any other user of the statutory plans or activities where we might not be applying for consent, but it begs the question, should we apply for consent to conduct our practices through the waterways? Should we apply a consent of a water take to ensure that there's water? The Heretaunga Taiwhenua has exactly that, a water take for environmental flows to keep water in there. I think that's an extraordinary measure to protect our values with a consent. And ideally we wouldn't have to go to those levels, but it does beg the question, is that's what is needed? I don't think we should have to, but we may have to explore consents for essentially what I think should be provided for in terms of our practices and our relationship with the waterways.
I take it from your comments too that part of your reason for promoting hard limits was that so our hapua marae had certainty over what's being talked about. Is that correct?
Yes. I've spent a lot of time discussing the issues and listening to tangata whenua and discussing the issues with our statutory managers, the same stuff. So there's part of self-interest to minimise the amount of time I have to talk about the same stuff and have certainty for me and provide some confidence for those interests I'm attempting to advocate for, that we have something solid and I don't think it necessarily has, we're saying it's bold because it's a step from what's currently here. I don't think we should be saying it's bold, and I don't think we should be saying it's precautionary. We're talking about precautionary management of an aquifer after the gastro outbreak. I would like to think that it was more of the norm to safeguard human health and well-being of our waterways, and not we're taking this big step into something that might be viewed as unnecessary or aspirational.
Can I take you up about that statement of a lack of hard limits? if you look at Schedule 26, which is the water quality one, which is about so big and so thick, it's full of hard limits. It's got limits for all sorts of water quality parameters for various catchments.
Sure.
Some of them are passed over to the Kaitahi plan where they don't have enough information at the moment, but there's pages of 30 or 40 pages of hard limits in Schedule 26. Fair comment?
I'm going to pass it over to my planner, and it'll probably in their evidence and Shade Smith's evidence. But no, I don't think it's a fair comment because it has to be taken in context with timeframes, objective policies, and the rules.
I accept the comment about the time frame, but I don't accept the comment about the lack of hard limits. The same in Schedule 31 for flows and restrictions on use. There's a series of minimum flows, there's restrictions on use, and there's a proposed hard limit, which you've questioned about the number of, on the total volume to be taken from the aquifer. So, in my view, all those things are definitely hard limits as part of the proposed plan change.
Well, I think our planner evidence and evidence of Shade Smith can elaborate on that. But I will say, in terms of water quality, in the rules, there are activities that are permitted that weren't permitted in the existing plan in terms of water quality. And I think that's a step away from the no degradation calls. If our current the policy within the RMP hasn't provided them as permitted activities, and now they are permitted activities, I think that creates leniency. With regard to the total allocation limit, well, that's quite aspirational, and it stands alone unless you have the follow-on application through reducing water takes through every single consent, because if the that table with the consents look like it's double what is being used, then in theory we have to reduce every consent by approximately, well, maybe not half. My plan will collect it, but it requires a significant reduction of the water take consent, so that hard limit would be relative to the reduction, and other limits, what was called for flow limits, which is in the MPS, and there's nothing mentioned on water level, sorry, not of the aquifer. But if I can pass it on to Greg.
Starting with Schedule 26, I think. The problem in my analysis of the plan is that the grand effect of Schedule 26 is that whilst there are limits, I agree with you, the framework set up by the rules within PPC 9 as proposed rely on either the use of farm environment management plans or belonging to an industry collective for land uses. So farm environment management plans are not a mandatory requirement. And the catchment collectives, my assessment of those provisions within the schedules that relate to those, and taking into account the fact that there are timeframes of 3, 6, and 9 years, depending on if you're in a priority catchment, that the grand effect of all of that is essentially an information gathering exercise. And that's, again, Council has relied on the fact that they don't have enough information about nutrient loading and how a nutrient budget might occur, and that this plan change will essentially be used to gather that information. My view and what I have presented in the track changes version is that the farm plans need to become a mandatory requirement. The catchment collectives, that's all well and good. Those can sit there as non-regulatory options, if you will. But that there must be a regulatory mechanism by which activities are regulated in order that we can even begin to think that we might achieve those limits set out in Schedule 26.
So how would you regulate non-point source discharges from a catchment? The only feasible way of doing it is to say, this is the outcome we want down the bottom of the catchment, because you're dealing with potentially diffuse sources all over the place.
Absolutely, and I agree, and that's, I think, an issue we're grappling with at a national level. I think that we can begin to take steps towards that, though, and I've suggested some changes to the non-point source discharge policy in the first instance. But likewise, we need to be, especially within the tank catchments, we have productive land uses that are having significant adverse effects in terms of nutrients, and we must, in my view, bring those into a regulatory framework in order that we can measure them and see what's actually on the out, and use those Schedule 26 limits. Likewise, I've suggested that looking at a nitrogen loading cap might actually be a tool, and that was suggested by the Heretaunga, Made Apatu in his submission, I believe it was, as a blunt instrument, and we know that that's actually coming in anyway at a national level, and that we need to, and I think it's not perfect, but it is at least a step towards having some kind of baseline that we look at what's actually going on, so that we can hope that we can reach those targets in terms of what's coming out.
It's an incredibly high number they put in it, but that's another matter.
Sure, yes, and I won't debate in terms of the actual number and what's appropriate. That's not my area of expertise, absolutely, and I know a rule of thumb, that people use, I myself use in my own property. But I think just to, if you want, I can go into, in terms of the hard limits, in terms of the allocation regime as well, because I think that's the other piece of your question. The effect of the rules as proposed is that existing takes can continue, and now as a restricted discretionary activity, in fact, with a non-notification clause. There is no discretionary, whereas under the RMP at the moment, those would be a discretionary activity, and you would expect a fulsome AE that would need to deal with whatever potential adverse effects there might be of those takes. So because we're using an actual and reasonable use test as well, where then if you're an existing consent holder, all that you now need to do is bring, that all that's being done is we're matching the consented levels with the actual use levels. That's the effect of Plan Change 9. So essentially, it is encompassing and providing for the status quo to continue.
Yes and no. That depends, for instance, on the aquifer, what the limit is, and how much is actually being used now. So I'll leave it at that.
I'd say, because the approach being taken is to look at demand rather than supply.
Correct.
And so I'm not sure that it does depend as such. My assessment of the way that the rules are set up is that they will enable existing takes as they are essentially to continue. There's no significant clawback or change to that regime. And in fact, PPC 9 says that, and says we will reconsider that at 10 years, essentially. And there's no certainty provided in terms of how that will occur and what that will look like.
Thank you.
Just to, I think no better example exists than right out here for this stream, and perhaps hard or bold might be the wrong prefix. Maybe it's environmental or cultural limit, but in this table here, there's no limit for I think it says Kārewere o Paritua, and 93% of that stream is extracted through groundwater takes. And in that scenarios report, that's largely attributed to irrigation. So there's no limit on that stream. As a result, 7%, or I think it's 27 litres per second, if I can remember, flow is remained, and 344 litres per second is taken out. There's no limit, and that's with. So I don't think any limit would be better than nothing. Otherwise, with that 7% or 27 litres left in the stream in a dry season, that's what's evaporated. So, I mean, the numbers speak for themselves, and perhaps that's the other area of my expertise of looking at the numbers, paint a story, and been using the numbers that are afforded to us. That's a pretty bleak story, but the pictures on the wall, I'm not sure if, they're actually that stream there is one that fell down on the ground there, and all those at the back of the same waterway, that
Except that
a limit for it would be an improvement, and I guess I've articulated as a limit as what everyone else has been saying the issues, and I've put it in policy. A limit would help solve those,
well,
as well as monitoring to see how we're tracking with that limit, or if it's too difficult, at least a target.
I think my difficulty with those limits is that at the moment they've got no hope of achieving them without significant interventions. And I've got a question for Mr. Smith that I've already signalled to him as a follow-up around that.
I mean, that's been discussed at length, and I think that's relative to time to achieve it. So the discussion was, we have perhaps it's the timeframes to improve water quality and water quantity, and if you flip it around, perhaps it's the timeframes for the water users to adapt. And we're quite pragmatic. We're not suggesting, cut people's thirst for water immediately. But we have to have a discussion about a transition of that use, not transition to improved water quality. But if this is our target, and if this is what the regulatory framework says, and we're beholden to that, then we at least expect some that'll be utilised, the policies, and not have to, I guess, adapt or accept that cultural values are subservient to anyone else's values, because that's basically what's been decades of management practices.
Yeah, I very much, I think my comment to Mr. Black was along those lines, that it's heading in the right direction, but it's it's proposed to be a slow process. And yeah, we're well aware of that issue. Sorry, do you want to follow up? I just had a few questions of clarification, or do you? So, just a few questions of clarification in your evidence. And my first one is at 100, which is simply to say that Pukawa Peka Peka were one of the candidate water bodies in Plan Change 7 as outstanding water bodies.
Yes.
Which Dr. Marker and I, among others, have been considering, and we'll have our decisions on that soon.
Sorry, page 100?
Plan Change 7, which listed your paragraph 100.
Yep.
So that was actually a proposed outstanding water body in Plan Change 7. So you'll have our decisions on Plan Change 7 fairly quickly, because I was trying to get them out before this hearing, but haven't quite succeeded.
You're indicating there's more reading.
Yes.
Yeah, and the Plan Change 7 was a result of our PC5 mediation. You're probably glad that you didn't read any more of my evidence on that, which I was just totally snowed under, but the idea is obviously tangata whenua can provide the whakaaro around its cultural importance of water bodies. But I did touch on it, Poukawa, particularly because of the law of hapuku, which I referred to, or which is, can you bring up our slides?
It's all right, there's no need to expand on that. Can I just take you to your paragraph 109, please? Oh, sorry, 105.
Yep.
Can you read that paragraph, because I don't understand it. The policies in PC9 confuse, I presume,
The terms,
over allocation, and essentially do reduce water use, and therefore, haven't you left out the word "not" in that sentence?
yeah, I think you're right there.
So that should read, and essentially do not reduce water use?
Yes. That is reference to reducing over allocation may not reduce actual water use. It has potential to, and it may not. As I said, the over allocation is the theory of use, that black line, and those the actual use of the pink and the green. So addressing the over abstraction will address the causes rather than the symptoms.
And the other one was your paragraph 126.
126, is it? High flow, yeah.
So I assume this refers to the Nararora.
Yes.
Can you explain the last sentence to me, please? It seems to be, you say
So-
high flow allocation is too high and does not adequately consider the natural character and natural functions. So by that you mean the proposed 8,000 litres a second, I think, of high flow allocation from the Nararora, is that?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. What about the minimum flow, which is provided for that, which I think is 20 cubic metres a second? Is that a realistic starting point for a high flow allocation?
I will refer to Mr. Smith's evidence and Mr. Black's evidence in that regard.
That's all right. I'll get Mr. Smith to make a note of that question, please, and he can answer it, because I'll probably forget. That's all my questions.
Yeah, it's an observation more than anything else. And for fear of sounding like a stuck record, I want to go back to the question I raised with legal counsel earlier on about boldness. And you being a practitioner, one of the few Maori practitioners in the business, I wonder whether councils or even iwi authorities are being bold enough to deal with what some people might view as a planning system that makes it really hard for others to participate in. And by that I mean, is there scope in your mind for a more Maori-centric planning system, process? And if you think there is, what might that look like?
Yes, in terms of the process. So it's been involved in a lot of plan changes. I've learned considerably a lot, and like to think that have promoted those learnings into further plan change process. Well, actually, I have. And I've said I wouldn't engage in this the way the tank process was run, and I've been in discussions with tangata whenua from Mohaka and with the Wairoa. So with what's transversing in the Mohaka, those are based on my advice. And my advice was tangata whenua to develop a plan for your awa with regards to policy, so have a planner for yourself. The first step is to avoid going straight away into stakeholder engagement if you do not know what you want for your awa and you can't articulate it in the language like the plan change has or the catchment plans have. Because it's problematic, because if you enter into a room, you're often amongst a lot of other interests who know exactly what they want about a specific part. And for tangata whenua, we've got interests across the whole lot. And you're competing with people who know down to the litre and become problematic in setting high flow allocation, because what does that mean in terms of those numbers? I doubt the majority of the tank group really understood what we were agreeing or not agreeing to. So with the Mohaka, and I've been involved in those discussions, the few initial ones, and with Ngāti Pāhu Wera primarily, and suggested you've done enough wānanga on your cultural values, now you need to articulate it with some expertise to assist you with your own independent expertise. And so the stakeholder part, and it was there was a meeting in council, and it was with Pāhuera and other tangata whenua mohaka. They parked the stakeholder part. And then council, regional council planners sat with Ngāti Pāhuera. And I don't want to, I haven't asked, I can't quote them, but that didn't work as much as they would have liked. So that was a year and a half maybe process. And then stepping away, Pāhuera has now had support from regional council in terms of resources for their own planner and a water quality expert. The planner being Vanessa Tipuki, who's a Māori planner for perception planning, which we've had work with. So I suggested those, and they've used it, and Kate MacArthur, who's an expert. And once they've set what and had those discussions, which I think has to include every season over the year, on what you want for the river relative to all its characteristics over a season. And then once you have that plan, then you sit with regional council who have a fair idea of what they want, and then you have to come, that's the partnership there, and that's after some equity in terms of resources being put for it for tangata whenua, and you sit there with them, and then you can ascertain how much of the Pāhuera plan, let's say, is reflected in the final outcome. And I suspect that with council and tangata whenua reps, that could take a while, but after that, that partnership is you step away and then engage the community, holding hands, in partnership, tangata whenua and the council, and saying this is our plan, forward we do. And where it may not include 100% of what tangata whenua wanted, but you can get a fair representation of what was in their plan, because those aspirations don't change a great deal over time, as opposed to these catchment plans of what tangata whenua seek. And I think that is a more meaningful treaty partnership way forward, and that's based on my learnings from other catchment plans and in correspondence with tangata whenua working for Mohaka. That seems to be working.
I mean, as I see it, the sort of planning process has many sticky bits to it. One of them is the point that Commissioner Maka raised earlier on about the reo and the confusion that people have about Māori words that have been used, like Māori and all that sort of stuff. And the natural inclination is for people to say, well, don't use it. Whereas I would say quite the opposite. You use it.
Yes.
In fact, you use more rather than less, because people need to hear it. They need to hear these words. They need to become more familiar with their use and their meanings. And it's not the sort of thing we can continue to hide from, which is what we've tended to do in the past. And it was those sorts of things. I know it's kind of an unfair question to ask, and it's probably something you might just go away and reflect on as something for your thought processes going into the future. Because I think that's where some of our real challenges are, to change some fairly fundamental things in our planning processes. And one of them is around reo. I mean, RMA, sort of introduced kaitiaki like it never existed before. And there's a lot more of those sorts of things around that. Maybe it's not the RMA that's going to do it. Maybe it's going to have to be local councils who are going to have to highlight these things and really push them home. And I just happen to think in this particular hearing, this exercise that we're involved with here, one of the biggest problems is the language one. It really is. Because some people aren't hearing the language of the other people, and the other people aren't hearing the language of these people. If they are hearing it, they're not interpreting it in the way that I think each one of the language users intends it to be. And that's not just Māori. It's the English as well that I think really is one of the testing sticky points here. And I leave that as food for thought. Because, I mean, I guess from my point of view, we can't continue to do this, keep perpetuating this sort of thing forever. We'll be here next year with another plan change and asking the same questions, going through the same sort of stuff. As many, you heard a lot of the people yesterday saying, we've had these same questions for the last 20 years, 15 or whatever. And I personally, I get sick of hearing the same questions all the time. You just hear them and you're wondering where are the answers. And I think it's in the boldness thing that the legal counsel referred to earlier on. We've got to be bold. We've got to step outside of the almost the kind of comfort blanket that the RMA process affords us at the moment, because it does. We go back to the RMA all the time and say, this is what the RMA says, so we're kind of stuck there in a way. So I do believe that for an issue like this, which is a hugely important issue for Kahungunu, for this rohe, but not only this rohe, every rohe in the country. And you know, other rohes are looking for leadership on this sort of thing, and I would have thought that, you know, here's not that I'm beseeching Kahungunu just to get out there and be a leader in this space, but it does, I think it requires a lot more boldness, and that'll be my last comment on boldness.
I think you make an excellent point, and I feel like the meat in the sandwich sometimes, and I have said to some tangata whenua, if you want the outcome, we've got to speak in the language. What gets the outcome, whether it be science, Japanese, English, Māori, if the outcome is the focus, then we will try and articulate it in that context. And I've put that slide up to show you what we have to sort of go through to facilitate change, and to basically be Māori and exist Māori in relation to our waterways. So the first step is our mātauranga Māori observations, which were shared yesterday, that the water's disappearing, which is, in all honesty, not taken seriously. You have to prove it, typically through science, and that's the language we have to demonstrate. So we have to have science interpretation and employ people like Mr. Shade Smith, which costs money, and then that can be challenged. Good money. And then that can be challenged, different science interpretations, and if you get past that hurdle, you'll say, well, then are there adverse cultural impacts? Prove it. So we have to bring our kaumātua, our Kaitiaki to the table, say this has affected our cultural practices and our association with the river. We have to prove that. And then we say, well, is that, that's all good and well, but is that protected? Is there any statutory acknowledgements? Is there any policy? So we have to find policy or legal framework to ensure that they're protected. And we have to, in many instances, write it and describe it. And I get your point, defining these terms as much as possible, articulated in our kupu, in our words, while it aligns with these regulatory frameworks, these policy frameworks and existing definitions, but articulated as much as possible. And there is some difficulty that are they being understood, really, and that's, or are they appropriately captured? So we have to be involved in every kind of step, right down to the policy. And in the past, we're at the front, these are our values, and we're seeing terrible outcomes, and may be involved in the monitoring, which was right at the end of the spectrum. And so what's happening in the middle, in the planning context, we're not largely featured. And I think our council referred to all parts of development of plans and being involved as much as possible, and that's certainly what we've tried to be and offer. Because, you know, if we just talk about our stories and practices, and what's sort of happening is we don't do the practices, it's just the story, the theory that it's almost a myth. What, you went fishing in that river, really, or you used to baptise your kids in the river, and the fear is you know, that story just turns to someone's theory and transitions into myth in future. So I thank you for that question. It's definitely a difficulty I have in working in this space.
Thank you, Mr. Chuka. I think you're ready for you call your next witness.
Oh, I just got one more pitch thing that is useful with for flow augmentation that is, from experience, difficult to explain without my little whiteboard scenario. If you may entertain that description of the problems of flow augmentation.
Yeah, so it looks familiar. From your, there was augmentation evidence, was it?
No, I didn't draw this picture, but yes,
Okay.
it pertains to the flow augmentation. So
Okay.
I'm using where it exists now in the Twyford scheme, where it used to be called flow enhancement, but from my evidence saying that it actually diminishes stream length, habitat, ecosystems, and springs. So this is a rough drawing of the network of, you know, we got hundreds of spring-fed streams and hundreds of springs. There's a slide. Shay, can you flick to that slide of the springs? Mine. This is the monitoring site, the low flow, and these are, sorry for you guys can't hear. So these are all the streams, and these are diffuse springs. It's not 100% accurate. And these are point source springs, big puna, they're called Ngā Puna in the Twyford. And they all feed into these, it's an extensive network and come through this flow site. So the proposed augmentation means that there are 3 sites, and I'll just roughly put them here, where you would basically pump water into the springs at these points, 3 points. One of them might be mobile, and you pump more water in here to go past this flow indicator to show that there's still water in the streams. The problem with that is, and allow further groundwater takes. The problem with it is that the indicator becomes an indicator for those points I just drew.
Yeah.
And no longer is an indicator for anything up here or beyond the flow augmentation sites.
That's right.
And when you have 30 sort of streams, you can't possibly cover them all. So all this habitat, all the stream length disappear and starts here. So you're effectively replacing the springs with a tap. And we've already had hugely modified waterways where they're straightened, and then you're replacing our puna, which is a significant taonga, with a tap to flow in to here, and the indicator is no longer an indicator for the subcatchment, or what it's supposed to be an indicator for. You're just tricking it, and it's going, yes, there's flow in the river, but it's not an indicator for what it was designed for, and it, in practice, allows continued groundwater takes beyond a point that they've ever taken before. And this is what I'm talking about with hard limits. You're allowing further groundwater takes beyond any take before. This is coupled with other management regimes like tile drains that are exporting water, and these springs are beautiful springs here that we'd like to see protected. But if this indicator well, which is just about flow, is basically duped by these points here, it's no longer a fair representation of what it was initially put in there for.
Yep.
And it's been difficult trying to have that conversation without drawing that diagram. So.
Okay. I clearly understood it from your evidence, so you explained it well. And I've seen this type of scenario before, and I think the panel is quite aware with what you're saying in terms of, and this is one of those issues you have in FMUs where you have a measuring spot, and it might have been the monitoring station for 30 years for lots of good reasons 30 years ago, and a lot of investment has been put into that, but it isn't nearly a reflection of the subcatchments, and certainly not of all of the waterways and the nuances and characteristics of them. So, point well made.
Thank you.
Cool. Thank you.
Ka tangi te titi, ka tangi te kākā. Ka tangi hoki a hau, wati hei wā mauri ora. Mihi tuatahi e te atua. Ko ia te timatanga me te whakamutunga ngā mea katoa. E te whare, e tū nei, tēnā koe. A hoki kia papa atua nuku ki waho nei, tēnā koe. I ngā hunga mate, kua whetūrangi tia, haere, haere, haere. I ngā hunga ora i tēnei wā, tēnā koutou. E ngā tangata whenua, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou. O taumata māhoi te maunga, ko tāngongi te wai, ko tumuana te tangata, ko tinana te waka, ka ū ki uta ki wai papa e. Tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. I'm from Muri Whenua, te raroa te iwi, ngā te ao, tūri o hina, taha wai me ngā te pakuhi aku hapu. As a result of my whakapapa, I again say greetings once, greetings twice, greetings thrice to the panel and to my whanaunga here e uri o kahuhununu. Ko Shade Smith taku ingoa, senior analyst at Ngāti Kahungunu Iwi Incorporated with a background in environmental and marine science. Since 2006, my work's has focused primarily on assessments and monitoring of activities affecting aquatic environments in both the freshwater and marine space, including the ecological effects of discharges and more broadly on aquatic ecology and its response to environmental impacts. My expertise includes general freshwater marine ecology, benthic ecology, statistical design and analysis of kaupapa Māori assessments of aquatic environments. I have a master's degree in marine science, prepared and presented a number of briefs of expert evidence to RMA decision makers on these matters that I've described a number of occasions over the years. And through my work, I've conducted survey and assessment work extensively throughout the Hawke's Bay region, including a number of assessments within tank rivers, streams and estuaries. My evidence in particular applies in particular to the effects that may arise from changes in water quality and quantity limits and associated regulatory timeframes for targets and unintended consequences of artificial flow compensation in tank waterways as a result of proposed Plan Change 9. My evidence is conducted from within a Western scientific context. I just want to, I guess, introduce the concept of that the environment that we're considering here today is a growing acknowledgement amongst the mainstream scientific community that the stresses on these environments that traditionally be considered in isolation. How now there's a growing acknowledgement of the synergistic effects of these stresses to cause wholesale changes in aquatic environments and the unintended consequences of implementing solutions without addressing fundamental imbalances. The RMA emphasis is on managing effects. And our argument is that given the degraded state of the aquifer, and by extension connected streams, rivers and springs, having been mined down over the last 40 to 50 years, that the proposed mitigation, flow compensation, there's unintended consequences as a result of that. And the most precautionary remedy remains setting firm limits on allocation, and that number is the 70 million cubic metres per year, and essentially clawing back water when consents are reviewed. Question, I want to acknowledge, I guess, that in PPC 9, that there is an acknowledgement in there that the system is over-allocated, i.e. that if all consented water users made use of their full allocation, then the Heretaunga Plains groundwater system would collapse. And again, this acknowledgement in the plan allows exploration of solutions to remedy. However, at current abstraction already, we're seeing numerous manifest effects which have been described over the last few days. I just want, I guess, to go to particular areas of concern. And this plot here is SOE groundwater level monitoring well in Fern Hill. It's in the Ngaruroro River recharge area. I think it's the longest time series for water level monitoring in the on the plains, and it dates back to, on this plot, to the 1980. And as you can see, there's increasing level of variation, interannual variation, concomitant with a significant declining trend in water level. And that actually picks up around the time of the disestablishment of the artificial recharge system in Fern Hill, which is that little hump in the middle there where they it was no longer considered viable. And from my analysis, and having read the review of why the artificial recharge system was disestablished, it was based on economic imperatives.
Mr. Smith, would this well be in a hatched area or whatever it is on the map of the Aurora? Would this be now a well that would be treated as a surface water tank?
Sorry, I missed the last bit there.
Sorry. How far away from the river is this well?
I think it's about two kilometres from the river, roughly.
So would it now be treated, would that well now be treated as a surface water tank? There's the map that's...
So this is a state of the environment monitoring well only. So it's not been abstracted from, it's simply there to monitor.
Okay, so this is purely state of the environment?
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
Yes. And so from this plot, we can see there's been a loss in storage of the aquifer of around about 1.5 metres over that period of time. Another plot, which is sort of even more stark, is a well which is near here. Again, it's a monitoring well, and you can see those highlighted points there. As Mr. Murray Black pointed out, over successive years, they're essentially the lowest point that they've ever been. And again, from this plot, on average, there's been a 2 metre decline in storage or water level in the underlying aquifer from this well. So when I say that there's numerous manifest effects, it's not only in the connected streams that we see that, which the whānau have eloquently described, but also in the unseen, in the storage of the aquifer.
So the left-hand axis is depth from the surface, is that correct?
Sorry, yeah, they're very small numbers there. That's
Yep.
right. The Y is time, depth, and X is time. So roughly the middle of the plot there, I think, is 10 metres, and then it goes down to, so it's roughly about 2 metres. Each one of those divisions are 2 metre divisions.
So what would be the source of recharge for this well, do you know?
So this is a plot, shows some hydrochemistry data that's been supplied by our colleagues at GNS, who also have contributed to a lot of the understanding that's gone into the model for Heretaunga Aquifer. There was some contention, I have to say, that was stated in the reports, which sort of, I guess, cast some doubt on the hydrochemistry data. Since the 2018 report, on which the groundwater scenarios report was done, there's been some additional sampling for hydrochemistry, essentially aging of the water to try and disentangle the which areas of the aquifer are predominantly recharged by the river and which areas are predominantly recharged by rainfall. And this plot here, thematic map, I guess, demonstrates that in the southern part of the aquifer, those green circles there indicate tracer data suggesting that that area of the aquifer is largely rainfall, recharged by rainfall. You'll see the dashed blue lines there, they're the Holocene gravel fans from the Ngariroro to Taikuri, and there's a green one which is really hard to see from the Tuki. And so, through those fans there, you get really quite high speeds, groundwater speeds, whereas in the rainfall recharged areas, so in this area, speeds a lot slower, and so I would suggest that those areas that are rainfall recharged primarily are more vulnerable to the effects of over-abstraction and not able to rebound as quickly as, say, those areas that are more river recharged.
So my follow-up question to that, which you're probably aware of, is that should there be greater restrictions on, you talk about a 70 million cubic metre, and the council suggests a 90 million cubic metre for the Heretaunga Aquifer. But when I look at that particular information, what that suggests to me is that a harder limit should be in place for those, for the southern part of the south bank of the Nauroro, in a particular area you could draw around there, whereas in some of the other areas it doesn't seem to matter so much.
Yes, that's exactly it. In those areas that are more prone to the effects of over-abstraction as a result of their more sporadic recharge, then yeah, there should be firmer guidance and direction on setting limits. And in fact, the area in this particular area, as an anecdote, when we're driving past here and you see the stream dry, and then you carry on and there's pivot irrigators pumping water onto the land, and then you see, downstream where the river comes back, a paddock of irrigated tomatoes, where the ducks are luxuriating in the water that's between the rows of tomatoes. So, it's self-evident almost that, in those areas of the aquifer now we've got sufficient information to, and I acknowledge that the regional council have acknowledged that there is a problem here in this particular area, and but I don't see that there is the necessary wherewithal within the policies and objectives to claw back that water in these areas that are vulnerable, and in fact there's an ability to transfer water takes within the Heretaunga Plains groundwater unit that don't seem to take account for that vulnerability. So, yeah, does that answer your question?
It poses about a dozen as to how we might deal with
Usually
it.
the case.
So the rain, if this area is largely rainfall supplied, it hasn't got a big upstream rainfall catchment, has it? Back to Roy's Hill in that area, and not much further, Marae Kakaho Stream. That doesn't go too far back from memory. It wouldn't be a great area.
No, and you know the suppose that the vagaries of the weather and the forecasts that we are going to be experiencing drier conditions with climate change mean that we there is a need to, I guess, pull back and with the I was very heartened to hear the kōrero on the first day from Mr. Huata, who mentioned we have storage, it's in the ground here, and let's explore how we recharge that storage. How do we do that? So yeah, particularly this area is quite different to a lot of the other areas of the Heretaunga Plains aquifer, and that that the water chemistry is different. There's a lot of it's very high conductivity. The water around, not very high, but it's around 600 millisiemens per centimetre, whereas the Ngariroro River is around 150. And I'll talk a little bit about that effect of that as I continue on in terms of how that may have affected the stream bed conductivity here in terms of using augmented water from the Ngariroro over time, and the effect of that potentially has been an increased conductivity of the stream bed to lose water to the underlying water table.
So my impression, and it's only an impression from being reasonably familiar with the area, is that the other spring-fed streams outside of the sort of those green wells that you've got are actually in reasonably, comparatively good nick, and particularly those ones further north. And this is my recollection rather than just observation, that they've all got water in them, they're all flowing, they've all got reasonable volumes. I was really surprised when I came here and saw the dry stream beds, because that's not what I've seen elsewhere. Is that a fair observation?
Yes, and indeed when we hosted our GNS colleagues around and we took them to some of the point source springs in the Ngāpuna area of Twyford, they were absolutely amazed at these, dancing sands and bubbling sands, if you like, and the clear water emanating from them, in a context of it was squash being grown in the paddock surrounding the spring, and no public access to them, and in fact, since that squash has been harvested in the last few weeks, there's been a wholesale input of subsurface drainage, so that paddock will be converted to the new 2D planted apples in order to lower the groundwater table. And so in that area, and I've, my concern, I suppose, is the effect of that lowering of the groundwater table on the flow from those springs, one, and then further disconnection of whānau from those springs. I mean, as it is, you could potentially walk up the stream to bathe in the spring if you so wished, or to practice mahingokai. However, with a a more valuable crop in there, I would expect security to increase and that disconnection to be further enhanced. So, you know, I also have been told by some of the irrigators in the area that Twyford I'm talking about that, you know, this is an anecdote, but it was shared with me, in that, hey, look, we're actually increasing the flow of the streams because we're lowering the water table, so we should be given some credit for that. So these are the sort of the conflicts and views, I suppose, that we're confronted with. But certainly your assertion that, yeah, in the northern part of the plains aquifer system, the springs are still there, they're hanging on, and I guess we're wanting to ensure that that remains so, and the connection to those springs from tangata whenua is able to be enhanced rather than, you know, decreased.
So to put it in very colloquial language, I understand that the Hiratonga aquifer, the limit is to be managed as though it's a bathtub and it's all coming from the same source. But that doesn't seem to be observation, and the sort of well levels, those sort of things would suggest it's not actually a bathtub. And, or if it is a bathtub, it's maybe it's more than two bathtubs, and one bathtub's 70% full and the other bathtub's 70% empty. If that's, I don't know if that's a fair analogy or not, but it's a very simple one, but it's certainly what's indicated on a map like that.
Yeah, I would agree with you. Yeah, you know, I have to acknowledge that I'm not a hydrogeologist.
And nor am I.
And so, you know, we're surrounded in this room by hydrogeologists who I'm sure would be able to paint a better analogy. Sure. But I would tend to agree with you, and that, you know, I guess managing the aquifer as a whole, it would render some areas that are vulnerable to those effects of over-abstraction, they would be significantly worse off.
Can I ask for some staff comment on that?
Yeah.
Could we have some staff comment, at some written comment on that at some time? From, not now, but in due course, from one of your scientists, as to whether there are distinctions between different parts of the aquifer that may require different management. Thank you.
One of the questions I had was on a similar vein, and it's, I suppose that's in that same advice, is about just understanding the connectedness and partial connectedness of the aquifer.
Can I have one more question on
Absolutely.
groundwater, Mr. Smith? And I know you said you're not a hydrogeologist, but is it your understanding that an allocation, a groundwater allocation cap of 70 million cubic metres will not only stop groundwater levels dropping, but will cause them to start rising again, reversing that trend you showed on the monitoring wells earlier?
That's the intention in us proposing the 70 million cubic metres per year. That, in combination with, for example, some of the work that's being conducted at the moment with some other colleagues at the recharge area, you know, so that particular area where that well 10371 is just located downstream of is got significant gravel extraction in there. As a result, there's been a training of the river to the northern side of that area, which, you know, well, I suggest that has a negative effect on the ability of the river to recharge the aquifer at certain, say, for example, you asked about the 5,000 litre 5,000 litres per second limit for high flow allocation, high flow drafting off waters at high flow, and at those high flows is when compared to typical flows, it's when a large higher amounts of recharge are occurring. If you're training the river within the stop banks and you're reducing that area in which it's able to recharge by training the river to the northern bank, if you like, and away from the area where it's typically recharged, then you're going to reduce the amount of recharge to the aquifer. And so it's my submission that we should therefore take a precautionary approach. And as I say, that work is ongoing at the moment. And such time as that information does become available, I think we should act and when I say precautionary, I'm in inverted commas, I'm saying being bold in the sense of care and protection for the environment is under the hierarchy of the NPCFM 2020. So yes, I do think that a limit of 70 million cubic metres per year is both bold from that perspective, and it is precautionary.
Thank you.
Shall I continue?
Yes.
Yep. So that acknowledgement that there is over allocation occurring, I acknowledge that, but by not acknowledging that over abstraction effects are occurring, then, in my opinion, remedial measures are delayed. And so really the question of primacy is, are the policies and objectives sufficient whilst incorporating necessary redundancy or indeed the precautionary principle to account for uncertainties to prevent ongoing significant adverse effects or indeed collapse? I just want to talk a little bit about the Appendix 11, the memo and the hearings report, summary of key elements of science pertaining to water quality and proposed plan change 9. In my opinion, there's a number of issues with this document to be used basis for PPC 9, and I sort of alluded to it a little bit. It's essentially related to groundwater level data. Essentially the memo lacks detail on groundwater levels showing the extent of the decline that's already occurred historically. Despite this being a prime of importance, being able to contextualise current groundwater level situation. Niles touched on it in terms of the table down here. Out must equal in, but I also want to stress the importance of the storage parameter. And so out, traditional conceptualizations of an aquifer are from the, basically out is equal to in plus or minus storage, which the storage implicitly incorporates seasonal variability. Whereas the memo purports that PPC 9 management is based on a more simplified principle of out equals in. And it generally acknowledged that seasonal variability is the key issue for East Coast catchments in New Zealand, and that there's enough water on an annual basis, but not during the dry season. Given significant decline in groundwater levels, i.e. storage, and in particular the Ngāruroa recharge area, this apparent lack of consideration is concerning. As not all groundwater storage can be used since it's needed to sustain stream flows and prevent seawater intrusion. The amount is only a small amount of groundwater storage is actually available for use without impacting stream flows. Additionally, other drivers of groundwater storage drainage, changes to the river recharge mechanism, climate change, change in catchment vegetation, soil loss, do not appear to be considered with the primacy, in my opinion, that is required given the already significant reduction in groundwater levels. And I've sort of alluded to that with my comments around the, I guess, the large-scale development of subsurface drainage as we move to two-dimensional plantings into anticipation of automation for thinning and picking. So the effect of wholesale dewatering of the land to storage capacity of the aquifer, in addition to the development of a multitude of point source discharges to waterways with potentially elevated levels of nutrients, I don't think has been considered. That large-scale development of dewatering of the shallow aquifer, dropping of storage. I don't think I couldn't see anywhere in the PPC 9 where it has been even considered. Just, I guess, giving some, picking up from where Mr. Maury Black talked about a new normal yesterday. It's important that an impression of the extent of decline in water levels to date is appreciated and compared to pre-intensive abstraction conditions, i.e. water level decline over time from the natural state. Even small groundwater declines can have large impacts on users of shallow wells and stream flows, but less impact on large irrigation industry users that have deeper wells and usually are the main causes of decline. Just in relation to this plot here, and I note that the Appendix 11 memo is out of date. There's no recognition of hydrochemistry and isotope data showing robustly that the groundwater signature in the southern half of the aquifer is predominantly inconsistent with recharge from rivers. And so getting back to our awa here, this is especially critical, especially for Paritua Karewerewa, and that the absence of recharge from the Ngariroro River south of Roy's Hill implies a much more limited groundwater resource than previously thought in this area, with the result of severely declining water levels due to increased abstraction. In terms of the means to derive an allocation limit via determining actual reasonable use, this appears to be established by the irrigator via water meter records or modelling, i.e. by what the irrigator wants rather than what's available in the dry season. And again, this, in my opinion, contravenes Te Mono Tuwai, as referenced in the MPSFM 2020. Just wanted to make the point, really, the Section 42A report, some submitters' points, the response was that they don't give effect to the MPSFM 2020 as a reason to reject. In the case of setting an interim allocation limit of 90 million cubic metres, it appears, however, that indeed the PPC 9 placed the needs of irrigators above the needs of waterways. And as I'll explain in the case of the Paritua Karewerewa to exist at all.
Mr. Smith,
yes.
I think we've started off really well, and then we've gone back to reading your actual statement of evidence.
Indeed.
I always get worried because then I get into a lull and then I'm multitasking and I'm doing something else. That's usually a sign that actually you're reading it verbatim. So if you could pick up on the main points you want to make, that'll be fantastic. And I'm sure we may have some concluding questions for you too.
So I guess unintended consequences. So to my mind, without stream flow maintenance schemes, there's no way that the 90 million cubic metres per year limit is going to be able to be achieved. And so I wanted to talk a little bit about some of the unintended consequences of stream flow compensation schemes. And from personal experience, having worked in for consent holder, the Twyford area in the past, and my observations, certainly there's it addresses the proximate symptom. It doesn't address the underlying cause, but even the proximate symptom, sometimes is only partly addressed. In the case over in the Twyford area, it does regulate dissolved oxygen throughout the day in the hot, dry, sunny periods of the year, above, ANZAC guidelines, so 80% saturation for dissolved oxygen. However, it's still depressed from the natural. So compared to upstream, we add hypoxic groundwater, even though it's been actively aerated, it's still depressed, and that signature is evident some distance downstream. And as Ngao demonstrated with his whiteboard example, and from my calculations, compensates for around 20% of the entire Raupare stream network. So it's kind of tricking the flow recorder, really. Although in the consent it says he has to be as far away from the flow recorder as possible, there are constraints. You need to have a well which is close to a drain or a waterway in which to put it into. It has to be aerated. And then an example there where they've got it, it goes into a shallow drain, which isn't typically used, and trains a lot of sediment. And
Sorry, just on that, I had a question there, Mr. Smith, about the entrainment. How does that?
so it's
explain
essentially
it more?
it's essentially the entrainment of sediment from the stream bed. So where they put it in is the residual flow in there is maybe 1 litre per second, and then as soon as the groundwater is augmented into it, it jumps up to 60, 80 litres per second. That stream, that drain hasn't had that water in it, and it just that quantity of water entrains sediment from the stream bed, which then enters the Raupare and then is continues on in a turbid state for some distance, up to 140 metres downstream. And if, presumably that decreases over time, over say they're using it for a month, it might be like that for a week maybe, until, all the sediment that is going to be entrained has left the waterway. But to my mind, that's something that it's a consequence, and it's mentioned, but practically in reality, these are the things that we're continuing with. But I mean, the largest unintended consequence is that it only accounts for 20% of the available habitat in the Raupare network. From where they put it in to where the flow recorder is, it's only 20% of the stream network that is being compensated for. So now I just want to talk about unintended consequences of the awa here, and sort of briefly touched on it before in terms of the mixing of waters and the conductivity differences between impounded water that's taken from the Ngaruroro, stored in the dam, and is released down the waterway here. I just want to acknowledge or make the panel aware of an error in my evidence where I suggested that the augmentation of the paritua here is at the behest of the landowner upstream. Well, I was only made aware of the consent that manages the augmentation here from Mr. Murray Black after I'd submitted my evidence, and in fact it is controlled by resource consent. And so essentially the the taking and the putting of the Ngariroro River water down here is my submission that this actually exacerbates the stream bed, the loss of water from the stream bed over time. So let's just draw your attention to this picture here. This is from a report HBRC produced, I think it was Mr. Thomas Wilding, in 2018, spring stock take of the Heretaunga Plains. So the white stuff on that bottle here, this is a bottle from the stream here. It's called, it's a calcium carbonate precipitate on tufa, and essentially the tufa cements the cobbles and gravels together to form a type of sealant to the stream bed, and this slows down the loss of water from the stream to the underlying water table. Where you have a loss of solute as a result of, lower conductivity water from a different origin being put down the stream here, there's it dissolves the tufa over time. And the other, so you're getting a reduction in the sealant of the stream bed, making it more conductive. So over time, it's just losing water all the time rather than gaining water. The overall lowering of the water table in this area means that the loss is one way. Biofilms are really important to tufa generation, precipitating that solute out of the water, and biofilms only tend to occur or be produced in the aquatic environment. So for long periods of time, if there's no water here, you don't get a biofilm production, which then decreases the amount of tufa production, and therefore the sealing of that stream bed. So that's, to my mind, an unintended consequence of mixing waters from one area to another, and as a more general example of why we need to take the precautionary approach and manage the underlying issue, which is over abstraction, rather than trying to mitigate with a patch, albeit for a short period of time, by using these stream flow compensation schemes.
I'm just wondering, Mr. Smith, we've read the brief of evidence, and you're going into some detail about those, and I think what we might do is we'll let open up for questions, and then after our questions, if there's any concluding comments you might have, you can provide those. So, Dr. Ryder?
Thank you. Yeah, your paragraph 67, and 66, talk about use of action plans. So this is in reference to water quality, and plan change 9. And can you just elaborate on that? Are you implying that action plans are an important component of PC9? I'm trying to find where they are. The only reference to where I could find them was in Schedule 27. Well, I'll be guided by you on that, but my search is just in relation to some of the attributes in Schedule 27.
So it's my understanding that the Schedule 27 was deleted, and the attributes, particularly around the estuary, attributes for the estuary were incorporated into Schedule 26. Yeah. And
I meant Schedule 26, sorry.
Yeah, okay, yeah. And so those non-regulatory, that non-regulatory status of 27, by putting them into 26 became, regulatory, but the use of action plans is sort of in accordance with the NPCFM 2020. Again, they're not, they're targets, subject to an action plan with that time frame of 2040. And so my submission is that if you're going to use an action plan, which is essentially non-regulatory status, then you need to shorten the time frame as a sort of a quid pro quo to achieve that desired result. And, you know, that's the need to be boldness, or, which is speak for essentially a different paradigm for care and protection of the environment. And so that's what I'm talking about there.
So it's not inconsistent though with the NPS.
Use of action plans, is it? No. No.
Thank you.
We don't have any questions.
You've been quite, you and, I'll call him Nio because I can't remember his surname, sorry, Nio. You and Nio have been quite critical about non-regulatory methods to achieve some outcomes. But when I look at something like Schedule 30, it's very prescriptive as to how the farm management collectives are to work, and outlines a very detailed program. I know ultimately it's a non-regulatory approach, but it's driven quite hard by those requirements in that schedule. Perhaps it's a question for your planner rather than for you.
I would, yes, think so. However, I just, from my experience with the collective that manages the Raupare or Twyford scheme, you know, it really requires someone who's the champion.
Yeah.
You know, and people are busy. And if there isn't a champion that stands up to that passion, you know, it is a very difficult thing to achieve. You know, that might mean that there's a need for that person to be paid. And, you know, so what I'd say is that, you know, yeah, in theory it may seem like a good idea. In practice, the reality is that it really does need a champion to stand up. That's my view of it. Gray, did you have some?
I would question the effect of the certainty that they provide, really. And given, and particularly taking on board Mr. Smith's evidence, we actually need to shorten those timeframes below or to a nearer timeframe than 2040, potentially. I really question how that kind of non-regulatory pathway will be able to, I mean, you made the comment, I think, before that that those targets will be difficult to achieve. And I think that in light of that a non-regulatory tool, whilst I agree to some extent, I think when you actually dig down into the detail of what's in that schedule, I think, yes, it is a list and it is prescriptive to some extent, but the way that they're then encompassed by the rules, or not encompassed, makes me question how much information will actually be gathered from those, and how, and also the ability for regional council to influence further change if those activities aren't happening the way that they need to be happening. And I think the time involved with these kinds of programs and again, the level of uncertainty with them just doesn't match what I believed Regional Council was trying to set out to achieve through PPC 9, and certainly doesn't match what's needed to get to those targets within Schedule 26.
It may just assist also, I was just looking in the MPSFM, clause 3.7 is the NOF process, as you know. Bracket 2, bracket F says set limits as rules and prepare action plans, brackets as appropriate. So the action plan side of the equation is, if you like, discretionary, whereas the rules, as you know, are mandatory. So I think that is probably a better answer. And also clause 3.1 of the NPS says this part sets out a non-exhaustive list of things local authorities must do. So you can do other actions, if you like, above and beyond the mandatory limbs, if you like. So that's part of the answer. Thank you.
We didn't have any further questions. Was there any concluding comments? Let's say, do you have two concluding comments?
Just one. And it essentially is the relationship that we, Ngāti Kahungunu, have with various branches of the council. And that, you know, we had a mass eel death as a result of clearance of waterways some couple of years ago. And we worked really closely with the Regional Council's works group. The standard operating procedure for that was rejigged. And now we have Tile field techs assisting with that fish repatriation work whenever a digger goes in to clear waterways, assessments of waterways prior to works. And then so I compare this approach to that from in this process, where significant taonga species, eels, you know, they're routinely killed by dried up streams as a result of over abstraction facilitated by you know, essentially the rules and policies of the HPRC, and there's the unwillingness, I guess, to firstly for a long time admitting that these dried up streams were the result of over abstraction, and two, the unwillingness to address the effects by not significantly reducing allocation and allowing over abstraction. To my mind, there's two different perspectives there, and I have to think with some essence that unwillingness is a inherent need to try and balance the economic imperatives for that abstraction, which is clearly, as we've stated previously, in contravention of the MPSFM 2020 and Te Mano Te Wai.
Thank you. We're going to break now for lunch. Just in terms of our schedule this afternoon, I'm just wondering, I want to make sure that we give yourself the time that you need to present. So I'm just thinking, just to make sure that we make that 3 o'clock time frame, that we get back here at 1:45. That gives us a 45-minute lunch break. So we don't have to go anywhere for lunch, it's right next door. So please eat before you start talking. Ko te kaiata rangatiri he kōrero o tira. Yeah, so I'd appreciate that if you can go and have lunch, catch up with friends and family, and we'll start at 1:45. And so the next expectation, Mr. Enright, will we finish your presentations at 3 o'clock?
Yes, yeah,
Okay.
that's the plan.
Thank you.
Thanks for this.